So just getting started with sound. In terms of the physics of sound, which we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about, but it will help us understand a little bit of what we're seeing when we look at the sound files that we're going to edit. Sound generally, in terms of its physical properties, is a wave that's generated by a vibrating object in a medium. And a medium is any physical matter like air or water or something solid. Obviously most of the sound that we hear is traveling through the air. So it's vibrating the material or the matter of the air that we're all, hanging out in and breathing. It's actually similar to light in that sense, that light is just, waves of light that are traveling and bouncing off of things and giving us information about stuff. In general, people perceive a lot more data through light, through our eyes, than we do in terms of sound. Won't go into the whole evolutionary history of that, but we tend to perceive a lot more information about the world around us by using light and our eyeballs and the data that we can gather from that information than we do with sound. But sound is still very important. And obviously one of the reasons that sound is important is we can generate sound. We can't really generate light, but we can create sound with our voices. And so that's how we communicate. And so obviously that's an important part of our ability to talk and convey information. So this is what a waveform will look like when you're editing it in an audio editor. And what this represents, most of the time, there's different versions of this, but most of the time, the horizontal axis represents time, and the vertical axis represents changes in pressure or the waveform. So thinking about sound, it's kind of hard because we can't see it, right? It's hard to describe what sound is because it doesn't have a visual component. So we have to kind of come up with this visual metaphor for what we're actually hearing. So the change in pressure is how big the waves are that is generated by a sound. So if I clap my hands, I'm creating sound, right? And what's happening is I'm displacing the air between my hands. And the faster I do it, the louder that sound is going to be because that material is displaced. More material is displaced if I clap very quickly. And so that creates more of a distortion in the material. And that wave travels, in every direction, and eventually it hits your eardrum, and your eardrum can feel that wave, and it reinterprets it into sound in your brain. So that's what the vertical data represents, is how loud the sound is. Sound is more complicated than that, but those are the two basic components that you'll typically represent when you see a waveform like this. So there's a few properties of this sound wave. The wavelength is how wide the waves are. A lower sound is going to have a longer wavelength, and a higher sound will have a shorter wavelength. That's something we can actually demonstrate in Audacity. I'm going to try not to hurt your ears, but let's go over to Audacity. So one thing I can do in Audacity is I can generate sounds. So I'm going to generate a tone. And the default tone you can see is the frequency is 440. That's the wavelength, how large my wave is. And then the amplitude is how loud it is. And we can do one. This is 30 seconds. That's fine. We're not going to listen to it for 30 seconds. Okay, so when we're zoomed all the way out, this just looks like, one big thing. But if I zoom in a lot, eventually we're going to see our wavelength. And if I play this, hopefully the audio is actually working. Yeah. You can hear what that wavelength sounds like. And that sounds like that might sound familiar. That's this tone that they'll play at the beginning of an edit for a video or for a film or something like that to test that the sound is working. So if I generate a sound with a lower frequency, let's do 220. if I zoom in, you see that wavelength is longer, and the tone is lower. So most sound is not a pure sine wave like what we see here. Most sound has noise and other stuff in it. So it's not going to sound like that exact perfect tone. But if we do generate that tone, that's what it sounds like. That's how we create tonality. Where'd my Chrome go? Okay. So the wavelength, the amplitude is how loud it is, and that's represented vertically. And then the frequency is that distance in the sine wave, the distance between one wave to the next. All right, so we can see that here. So the wavelength is the distance between one full wave of the sound, and then the amplitude is how loud it is, how much pressure there is. And one thing that's kind of tricky is, so amplitude is represented both up and down, right? So sound is kind of going in these big waves, but the loudness is both up and down, the way that we represent it. So it looks like you would think that it's not like, this is like negative, right? This is just the other side of the wave. So it's the same loudness, even though it's below our sort of midpoint. Sound is measured in decibels. Decibels are also kind of hard to understand if you've ever used like Logic or GarageBand or something like that. You'll probably see that like most things level out at 0, like you're dragging things down, but that's relative. What's that?
That was me, sorry.
What?
That was me, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Oh, you're using. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so then frequency is the number of waves over time. So we can measure frequency in hertz. 1 hertz is just 1 wave. And the range of human hearing is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So 20 hertz is pretty low, it's almost nothing. But 20,000 hertz, it sounds high, it's really not that high. There's lots of like animals and well, I guess just animals that can hear much wider ranges of sound. And our hearing also diminishes over time. If I played a bunch of really, really high sounds, I would be able to hear less of them than you guys, most likely. I think I'm older than most of you guys. I also play a lot of music, and that has diminished the range of my hearing. So I don't know exactly what it is. You can test it by playing, I could play different high pitches and Audacity, and you guys would hear more of them than I would, but I'm not going to subject you guys to that because obviously it's very loud or very high-pitched. So pitch is related to frequency. We saw when we were playing those tones. The lower the frequency, the lower the pitch will sound. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch is going to sound. And music is really just sort of a human interpretation of those frequencies. We happen to use like 440 as the basis for A, but that's kind of just a random thing that was chosen. Some other cultures use a different scale that has different frequencies that form the basis for their music. So we hear things, but it's really what we're used to hearing, a kind of like human imposition of order over what the physical properties of sound. So when we digitize sound, so we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about editing digital images. When you have a photo or a film and you zoom in, there's no pixels, right? There's just infinite information. Analog sound is the same way. If I record sound to a tape or to a vinyl record, there's infinite information. I can slow it down, I can speed it up, and it's not going to distort. When we digitize sound, we lose some of that information. And so when we digitize we have to capture the information into zeros and ones on our computer. And so just like we did with our image files, that data has the same properties. The more data we have, the higher fidelity of the sound. The less data we have, the easier it is to transfer or listen to that sound, but it's not going to have as much information, and it may be lower quality. We may be able to hear the differences. So just like with our images, this has two components, sampling and quantizing. Sampling, we saw something really similar to this when we were talking about images. Sampling is how much sound data we sample over the course of a second. So most CD audio quality or your phone's audio quality, at least for a long time, there's different sample rates. A lot of stuff is recorded at higher qualities. But the default is 44,100 hertz per second. So that's like obviously a ton of information, right? It's hard to imagine that many slices of information in 1 second. But that's how fast our computer goes. So if we imagine the smooth line here as our analog sound, the sound that's being produced by an instrument or by your voice or something like that, when we record it on our computer, what we're doing is we're sampling the sound at these different parts. And the more samples we take, the more data we have, the more realistic the sound will be. We could probably do a quick demo of that. Let me see what the next slide is first. Okay, yeah, we can try to demo that. It might be visible, it might not be, we'll see. But with most of the stuff you listen to on your phone or on a website, something like that, it's going to be 44.1 or 44,100 kilohertz. If you're watching a movie, like at the movie theater, it's going to be higher quality. It's going to be like 96. It's going to sound more real. And you can really hear the difference. I don't know if the speakers in here are good enough for us to hear the difference, but let's try it. So in Audacity, you can see I have the project sample rate here. And so the lowest sample rate is 8,000. That's 8,000 samples per second. And the highest sample rate is 384,000. Okay, so it's a pretty big range. As I mentioned, 44.1 kilohertz is like kind of the default for a song on your phone. If you're watching Netflix, something like that. 48,000 is like if you want slightly higher quality. 96 is where movies are. Okay, or probably if you're recording like what they call like stems, if you're like remixing music and you want to get the stems, like the original files, they'll probably be 96 because they're going to be higher quality. So let's see if we can hear the difference. So I'll record my voice at 44.1. Okay, so this is 44.1 kilohertz. All right, let's listen to that. Okay, so this is 44.1 kilohertz. Okay, so this is 40. Okay, so this is 40. Oh, whoops. Okay. Why isn't it letting me? There we go. Kind of quiet, but that's okay. Okay, so then I can change the sample rate. So let's see if we change it down to 8,000. Oh, this is going to slow it down too. I'll just re-record it. Okay, so if I change the rate to 8,000, so this is 8,000 kilohertz. See if we can hear the difference. Yeah, it's hard to tell. The speakers are not probably good enough. If we try 96, this is 96K. Yeah, the speakers are a little too quiet and probably not good enough quality that we can actually hear the difference. But if you have headphones, if you try this at home with headphones, you'll be able to hear the difference. Okay, let's go back to our slides. So quantizing, so sampling is how many samples per second, how many recordings of the sound we're making per second. And then quantizing is how much data is in each of those samples. So it's similar to Photoshop where we have our number of pixels and then how much information goes into the color for that pixel. So the lowest is just 1 or 2. There's 2 possible values. If you have just 1 or 2 for a sound, you're not going to get a lot of information. It's not going to be very useful. So then you have 2 bits. You can represent a lot more data with 2 bits. Okay, there's 4 possible values. 16-bit gives you 65,000 possible values. So most sound is going to be recorded at 16-bit. That's kind of the default. If you record it at 8-bit, it's going to sound kind of distorted. And if you've ever played a retro video game or heard of the term 8-bit sound, that's what that style is. It's very simplified sound. 32-bit is higher sample rate. So if you're recording something in a music studio and you want it to sound good, you're going to be recording at 32-bit. So in Audacity, we can change that as well. So I have the project sample rate here. And if I record something, so I'm just recording this, you can see under stereo 44.1 hertz, it says 32-bit float. So that 32-bit is how much I'm quantizing or how much information is in each sample. And so I can change that again. So it gives me 16, 24, 32. I guess I can't go down to 8-bit. You probably won't be able to hear the difference between 16 or 32 because they're both high amounts of information. I wonder if there's a way for me to change it to 8-bit. If I go to effects, doesn't look like it has anything. Yeah, it doesn't look like there's anything I can use to change this to 8-bit, but that's okay. Okay. So when you're recording, depending on the quality you want, the default for the sample rate 44.1 or 44,100 hertz is a good sample rate. You won't really notice if it's it'll be good enough quality that you won't notice that it's missing some data. For the bit depth, 32-bit is fine. 16-bit you probably won't notice either, but those are kind of the basic defaults. You can see when I open Audacity, that's what it defaults to. Okay, so for capturing sound, there's a bunch of different options. The easiest one, obviously, is just to use your phone. In the tutorial, it goes over how to use voice memos, but there's a lot of different ways to capture audio with your phone. I assume everybody's going to have a slightly different, setup on your phone, so it may be a little bit different, but you can record. You can, plug microphones into your phone as well, but you can record just using the built-in microphone on your phone. You can record data and then transfer it to your computer and edit it in Audacity. We'll go over how to do that in a second. Some different software. There's a lot of different audio editors. If you know the term DAW or DAW, it's digital audio workstation. If you've ever tried to make music on your computer, you've probably heard that term before. As I mentioned, we'll use Audacity for the class project. It's pretty stripped down. It's pretty bare bones. There's not a ton you can do with it, but it's it's very good for editing something that doesn't have a lot of different parts, like a podcast. With a podcast, you might have some intro music, you might have some interviews, you might have your main voiceover, and that's easy to edit together with Audacity. if you're trying to make, you know, a hit song with drums and electronic instruments and vocal recordings and sound effects, all this different stuff, you're going to want to use something a little more professional or higher level. So Pro Tools is what most people use for that type of thing. Acid Pro is a sequencer that's good to use for just making, you know, beats and music and stuff. Logic is another program that's good for both. It's kind of similar to both Pro Tools and Acid Pro. Like, it has both of those components. You can do sequencers, you can do software instruments, you can do synths, all that kind of stuff, but you can also record vocals and add effects and stuff like that. GarageBand is kind of the stripped down free version of Logic. So if you've used GarageBand on a Mac before, Logic is basically just like a better version of that. Adobe Audition, which I've never actually even opened, I don't think, is the Adobe version of this. So like, you know, Photoshop or whatever. There's other stuff, like you guys have probably heard of Ableton. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say, can you use like one of these, like Audacity, to create like a room tone and where it just kind of place it on a video that you're using?
A room tone?
Yeah, like you're just getting the sound.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and then you can use Audacity for that?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you can record with Audacity. It can take inputs like a microphone or, yeah. What was I saying? Oh yeah, Ableton is more for like DJing and stuff. Like you can stretch or change the pitch of different songs to match them together. There's a whole bunch of other different stuff out there, but those are some of the basics. So some of the different audio types, and this is kind of similar to like PNGs and JPEGs. Like when we export our audio, these are the different types of audio that you'll get, and this changes over time. People introduce better formats. There's actually a really interesting like political history to this stuff, like why the MP3 was so pervasive for a long time. But we won't get into that too much. But these are some of the basic types you'll see. So wave is a lossless audio type. That means that it has higher file size and higher quality audio, so it doesn't cut out any of the frequencies from the original audio recording. AIF is the same thing, but it's specific to Apple. So, you know, it's pretty universal at this point, but it's mostly used on Apple products. PCM is the format that both WAV and AIF are based on, so it's a more generic version of this. And it's also, you know, it's lossless, so it doesn't lose any of the data. So all of those three first are kind of similar, and they're all going to be large files. Like if you record a song and you export it as a WAV, it's probably going to be like 30 megabytes or something like that. Like it's going to be pretty large. So then MP3 is this like standard that has been used for music for a really, really long time, like since the late 90s. And as I mentioned, MP3 is kind of controversial because it cuts out a lot of frequencies. MP3 makes the sound files very small by essentially saying, if you can't hear something, we're just not going to record that part of the sound. So it cuts out a lot of the high frequencies that we don't hear and a lot of the low frequencies that we don't hear. And some people can't tell the difference, some people can't. If you listen to a WAV file and an MP3 file on headphones, you'll probably be able to tell the difference. But if you listen to it on these speakers, you probably won't. So it kind of depends on the context. AAC is the Apple version of MP3. It's even smaller file sizes most of the time, depending on the type of audio. It was used like if you ever had an iPod, that was all AAC files that it would be converted to on the Apple. And then OGG, the last one, OGG Vorbis, is a much newer standard that is much better compression. So the amount of data is much lower, but the fidelity is higher. So it's a better compression format. It hasn't really been adopted because no companies own it, so they can't profit off of it. But you'll see it being used in more and more contexts, especially online, because it's it's a more efficient type of data. Okay. So yeah, these are just some tips for when you start editing and recording. You know, making sure that your equipment works is a good idea, especially if you're going to record something on location. make sure that it actually does what you want it to do. But the main thing is noise. So like when I'm recording, I'm recording right now to post this on YouTube later, and since this room is actually not that loud, you can hear my voice pretty well. But I teach in another room where there's like an air conditioning unit, like in the wall or something, like right next to where the computer is. And so there's like an incredible amount of noise, and it's really hard for the computer to tell which part is my voice and which part is the noise. So it does a really bad job of mixing that sound together. So the YouTube videos that I post for my other class are a lot harder to hear than for this class. And when I record stuff at my house, I have like a much simpler setup. Like I just have a nicer microphone when I'm doing online teaching and stuff like that. So you can really hear my voice and none of the noise in the background. So you can't always get rid of all noise unless you have like a fancy recording studio. We actually have a podcasting booth in the library. So if you are interested in recording something and you want it to be like really, really clean, you can rent the podcasting booth, or not rent. You don't have to pay money for it. You can sign out a time at the podcasting booth. They have really nice microphones in there, and they have a Mac in there that has Audacity, and you can just record, whatever you want in there. So, there's other ways to minimize noise. You can use like a pop filter. You can use audio gating. You can use different effects. But ultimately, the conditions that you record in, you're not going to be able to digitally change those conditions. So if you record something that has a lot of noise in the background, you can kind of balance it out. You might be able to get rid of some of it, but you're never going to be able to completely remove all of it. So setting up those conditions for recording first are important to having good recording quality to work with. All right, so we're going to go over this stuff in a minute. So yeah, I'm going to stop recording.